The wind had a voice, and it spoke the language of saws. For 3 days, it had been cutting at the edges of Caleb Hart's cabin, looking for a way in. It found the smallest cracks in the chinking and screamed through them, a high, thin sound that set his teeth on edge. Outside, the world had been erased. There was no sky, no ground, only a churning whiteness that had buried the sagebrush and was climbing the walls of the barn. The Absaroka Mountains, usually a dark, jagged promise to the west, were gone, swallowed by the storm. Caleb sat on a low stool by the cast-iron stove, the only true thing in the universe. Its heat was a solid presence, a wall against the cold that pressed in from all sides. In his hands was a piece of bridle leather, cracked and stiff. He worked saddle soap into it with a scrap of wool, his thumbs moving in slow, deliberate circles. The scent of the soap, the leather, and the wood smoke from the stove were the smells of his life. A simple trinity he understood. At 35, he had whittled his world down to things he could hold, things he could fix. A piece of land that fought him every year, a handful of cattle, and the tools his father had left him. He had once hunted buffalo, moving across a land that felt endless, but the great herds were gone, and with them, the man he had been. This small cabin, this patch of dirt, was what remained. A sudden, violent gust of wind hit the cabin like a fist. The single window pane rattled in its frame, and a fine powder of snow sifted from the sill onto the floorboards, where it melted into a dark, damp spot. Caleb didn't look up from his work. He knew the sounds of a blizzard. He knew the groan of the roof timbers under the weight of the snow and the howl of the wind as it scoured the prairie. He knew this storm was a killer, the kind that left cattle frozen upright in the fields and men lost a dozen feet from their own front door. That's why the sound, when it came, was so wrong. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the groaning wood, it was a faint, rhythmic thudding against the door. Tap, 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 a sound too weak, too human, to be real. He stopped rubbing the leather, his head cocked. The wind shrieked, mocking him, trying to convince him he'd imagined it. He waited. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the fire and the storm's endless sermon. Then it came again, louder this time, more desperate. Thump, thump, thump. Someone was out there. Caleb set the bridle aside and rose from his stool. He was not a tall man, but he was built like the scrub oaks that clung to the hillsides, broad and tough. He moved across the small room, his worn boots making little sound on the plank floor. He took the heavy iron poker from its hook beside the stove, not as a weapon, but as a precaution. In this country, you never knew what desperation looked like until it was standing on your threshold. He lifted the heavy bar from the door, the wood groaning in protest against the cold. He pulled the door inward a few inches. The storm lunged into the opening, a blast of ice and wind that stole the heat from the room and threw ashes from the stove. And in that swirling vortex of white, a figure stood, or rather, sagged. It was so coated in snow and ice it barely looked human, a walking mound of winter. "Help!" a voice rasped, thin and cracked. It was the voice of a woman. He didn't hesitate. Survival was the only law that mattered right now. "Get in," he said, his own voice a low rumble. He opened the door wider, holding it against the force of the wind, and reached out, his hand closing on a frozen wool sleeve. He pulled the figure inside and threw his shoulder against the door to slam it shut, dropping the bar back into place. The sudden quiet was deafening. The woman stumbled forward and would have fallen if he hadn't steadied her. She was shivering violently, her whole body trembling like a leaf. Snow cascaded from her coat, forming a melting puddle on the floor. He could see her face now, framed by a bonnet frozen stiff. It was pale, lips blue, with ice clinging to her eyelashes. She looked young, too young to be lost in a storm like this. "The stove," he said, guiding her toward the warmth. He sat her down on the stool he had just vacated. Her hands, covered in thin, useless gloves, were clenched into fists. He gently pried one open. Her fingers were white, waxy. "Need to get these wet things off," he stated, not asking. He went to a wooden chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out a thick wool shirt and a pair of trousers made of the same material. They were his, and they would swallow her whole, but they were dry and warm. He also took out a heavy wool blanket. He laid them on the bed. "You can change behind the blanket," he said, tacking one end of it to a roof beam and letting it hang down, creating a crude screen. "Leave the wet clothes on the floor. Don't worry about the puddle." He turned his back to give her privacy, busying himself at the stove. He threw another log into the firebox, the flames leaping up to greet it. He filled the coffee pot with water from a bucket and scooped in a generous amount of grounds from a tin can. The smell of the coffee beginning to heat was a good smell, a smell of life returning. He looked over at the pile of leather he'd been working on, at the neat rows of waxed thread and sharp awls. Everything had its place. Everything had a purpose. This woman, she had no place here. She was a piece of the storm that had found its way inside. He heard the rustle of clothing, a soft gasp that might have been pain or just the shock of the heat on her frozen skin. A few minutes later, she spoke, her voice still shaky. "I'm done." He turned around. She was standing by the bed, wrapped in his blanket, his clothes probably bunched up underneath. Her wet things lay in a heap on the floor, a sad, dark puddle spreading around them. Her face had a little more color now, though it was still alarmingly pale. Her hair, a dark brown, was damp and clung to her forehead. She had a strong chin, but there was a tremor in it she couldn't control. She looked proud, and that pride was at war with her circumstance. He saw the shame in her eyes, the humiliation of a person reduced to utter dependence. He poured a thick black liquid from the pot into a tin mug and handed it to her. "Coffee. It's hot. Be careful." She took it with both hands, wrapping her fingers around the metal to steal its warmth. She brought it to her lips and sipped, flinching at the heat and the bitterness. He watched her drink, her throat working. He then ladled a thick bean soup, salty and filling, from a pot that simmered perpetually on the back of the stove. He handed her the bowl and a spoon. She didn't speak, just took it and began to eat, her movements stiff and slow at first, then more urgent as the food began to chase the cold from her bones. He gave her space, turning back to his leather work but not really seeing it. He was a man accustomed to solitude, the presence of another person, especially a woman. In his small cabin was a disruption on a fundamental level. It changed the air, the light, the very shape of the room. He could hear her every breath, the scrape of her spoon against the bowl. When she finished, she set the bowl down quietly on the floor. The shivering had mostly stopped. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. He knew there were questions that needed asking, but they could wait. Hunger and cold were the first enemies. They had been dealt with, for now. It was she who broke the silence. "My name is Nora Quinn." Her voice was clearer now. "Educated. It didn't belong to this place. There was an agreement." She reached into a small, damp reticule that she must have been clutching under her coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was wet at the edges, but the ink, written in a bold, decisive hand, was mostly legible. She held it out to him. He wiped his hands on his trousers and took the paper. It was a formal-looking document, or a poor imitation of one. He read the few lines of script. "By mutual consent, the arrangement between myself, Silas Blackthorne, and Miss Nora Quinn is hereby terminated. Miss Quinn is released from any and all obligations, financial or personal, on account of a fundamental unsuitability for the proposed union. She is provided with passage back to the stage station at Sage Creek." It was signed with a flourish, Silas Blackthorne. Caleb read it twice. He knew the name. Everyone in Sage Valley knew the name. Blackthorn owned the biggest ranch, controlled the water rights committee, and had the sheriff in his pocket. He was a man who collected land and power the way some men collected stamps, and apparently, he collected wives through the mail, like ordering a new plow. Caleb folded the paper and handed it back to her. He looked at Nora Quinn, really looked at her. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but underneath it, there was a core of something hard and unbroken. She wasn't just a schoolteacher from Boston, which is what her speech and manner suggested. She was a survivor. She'd walked from the stage station in this blizzard. That was miles. A fool's errand that should have killed her. The station manager said he couldn't keep me. She said, her voice low, as if admitting a failure. He said the storm would last another week, maybe more. His supplies were low. For his family. She clutched the paper in her hand. The paper that was her shame and her freedom, all in one. A piece of property deemed unsuitable and returned. Caleb looked at the stove, at the fire burning steadily inside. He looked at the window, now just a black square against the roaring dark of the afternoon. There was nowhere for her to go. Sending her back out there was a death sentence. Taking her in was complicated. This was a small valley. Tongues wagged faster than a coyote could run, but the choice wasn't really a choice at all. Storms, not letting up, he said, his tone flat, stating a fact. Pass will be closed for a while. He stood up and walked over to the bed. He pulled the other blanket off it, a worn but clean quilt, and took the single pillow. He brought them over to the space on the floor beside the stove, not far from his workbench. He laid the blanket down, folded it twice for padding, and placed the pillow at one end. Nora watched him, her eyes wide, uncertain. "What are you doing?" "Bed's yours," he said, not looking at her. He gestured toward the simple cot against the far wall. "I'll sleep here. It's warmer by the fire anyway." He didn't want her thanks. He didn't want her story. Not yet. All the whys and hows of her ending up on his doorstep were just noise. The storm was the only thing that was real. The cold, the need for shelter. He picked up a piece of leather again, a torn rein this time. He took a needle, threaded it with a long piece of waxed linen, and began to stitch the tear. His hands were steady, his movements precise, a simple, honest repair. He could feel her watching him, a silent, assessing gaze. "You can stay," he said, his eyes on his work. "Till the road is clear." He paused, pushing the needle through the tough leather with a practiced shove. "No questions. Just survive first. We'll figure the rest out when the sun comes back." Outside, the wind howled its agreement, a long, lonely cry across the endless white. Inside, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire, the whisper of the storm through the walls, and the slow, steady rhythm of a needle pulling two torn pieces of a life back together. The days that followed were white and silent. The storm did not break, but it settled into a state of quiet. Malevolent siege. The wind no longer screamed. It moaned, a constant, low complaint that vibrated through the logs of the cabin. Snow fell endlessly, not in a blinding fury, but in a thick, hypnotic curtain of flakes that erased the world anew each morning. Time lost its sharp edges, measured not by the sun, which was a pale, forgotten memory, but by the cycles of the fire. A rhythm established itself without a word being spoken. It was a dance of survival, choreographed by necessity. Before the gray light of dawn seeped through the blanket-covered window, Caleb would be awake. He would move from his bed of hides by the stove, his joints stiff from the cold floor, and gently stoke the embers he had so carefully banked the night before. He'd add kindling, then a log, his movements economical and quiet, so as not to wake the woman sleeping in his bed. While the fire caught, he would pull on his heavy coat and boots and venture out into the pre-dawn chill. A path to the barn, now a trench carved between walls of snow that were taller than he was. Nora would wake to the smell of fresh coffee and the sound of his returning footsteps. She would lie still for a moment in the relative warmth of the cot, listening. The cabin was a world of sounds. She was beginning to learn the pop and hiss of the green wood in the stove, the groan of the roof, the sharp crack, like a pistol shot, of a nail contracting in the brutal cold. She would rise in the dim light, dress in the oversized woolens that now felt like a uniform, and take her turn at the heart of their small world. Her domain became the stove and the small table beside it. She learned to cook with what was available: salted pork, beans, dried corn, and the precious store of flour. She found a small crock of sourdough starter, dormant and forgotten on a high shelf. With a teacher's patience, she coaxed it back to life, feeding it flour and water, tending it like a fragile student until it bubbled with a sour, promising vigor. The first loaf of bread she baked filled the cabin with a scent so rich and warm it felt like an act of defiance against the frozen world outside. Caleb, returning from de-icing the water trough for his cattle, stopped in the doorway, his face ruddy with cold, and simply inhaled. He said nothing, but when she cut him a thick slice, still steaming, and he ate it. His eyes closed for a moment. It was a language more potent than words. She taught him, in turn, how to bank the fire. One evening, as he was about to douse the coals, she stopped him. "Let me show you," she said, her voice soft. She showed him how to rake the hot embers to the center and cover them with a thick blanket of ash. "My father did this in our cottage in the winter. The heart of the fire sleeps, but it doesn't die." The next morning, when he uncovered the coals and they glowed redly back at him, a flicker of respect showed in his eyes. They maintained a careful distance, a territory of unspoken rules. He slept by the fire on the hard floor, the thick, scarred hide of a buffalo bull his only mattress. She had the bed, the window behind it sealed not only with the blanket, but with a chaste and unbreachable propriety. They did not speak of their pasts. Her life in Boston, his life on the plains, it was all irrelevant baggage in the face of the storm. Their conversations were about the immediate, the pregnant heifer in the barn, the dwindling woodpile, the strange silence of the birds. Yet, in the long, fire-lit evenings, while she mended a tear in one of his shirts with the neat, precise stitches, and he carved a handle for a broken axe from a block of ash, the silence was filled with thoughts. Nora wondered about this quiet, capable man. She saw the hardness in his hands, the weariness in the lines around his eyes, but she also saw a deep-seated decency. He never made her feel like a burden. He treated her not as a woman, but as a fellow survivor, sharing his meager resources without any expectation of payment. The shame she had felt upon her arrival began to recede, replaced by a tentative sense of partnership. She clutched the wooden spoon she had brought with her from home, its surface worn smooth by her mother's hand, a talisman of a world that seemed a lifetime away. Caleb, for his part, found his mind circling back to the scrap of paper Nora had given him. A fundamental unsuitability. The phrase gnawed at him. It sounded like a man justifying a bad trade. He knew men like Silas Blackthorne. He'd seen them come west with money and lawyers. Men who looked at the land not as a living thing, but as a series of squares on a map. Assets to be acquired. What asset was Nora Quinn supposed to be? He pieced it together slowly, connecting disparate bits of saloon gossip he'd heard over the past year. Talk of surveyors for the Northern Pacific looking for a new spur line through the valley. Talk of Blackthorne buying up small homesteads. Always the ones that bordered Sage Creek. His own property was one of them. The creek cut right through his southern pasture. In this dry country, water was life. Water was power. A mail-order bride wasn't about companionship for a man like Blackthorne. It was about paper. A wife, legally bound, could file a homestead claim adjacent to his own, doubling his water access. The marriage was a contract, a business merger. So why terminate it? Why dump the woman at a stage station in the worst blizzard in a decade? It was sloppy. It was cruel. And it didn't make sense. Unless the deal had changed. Perhaps the railroad had chosen a different route. Or perhaps Blackthorn had found a faster, cheaper way to get what he wanted. Nora Quinn, the Boston schoolteacher, had served her purpose simply by arriving, a placeholder in a game she didn't know she was playing, and was now a loose end he needed to discard. The thought left a sour taste in his mouth. It reminded him of his father, a man full of grand promises and cheap whiskey, who had brought his mother out to this unforgiving land with talk of a grand future. Caleb remembered his mother's hands, cracked and bleeding from lye soap and hard work, her spirit slowly eroding under the weight of a man's broken words. She had become unpaid labor, her dreams traded for a life of drudgery until the land finally claimed her. Caleb had sworn to himself, a silent, solemn vow over her simple grave, that he would never be that man. He would never use another person, especially a woman, as a tool for his own ambition. This was why he kept his distance from Nora. It was a wall he built not just for her protection, but for his own. He was acutely aware of their situation, of the assumptions people would make when the snows finally melted. A man and a woman, alone for weeks. Tongues would poison the wells. Her reputation, already damaged by Blackthorn, would be ruined, and he would be the cause of it. The thought settled in his gut like a cold stone. A week bled into another. The routine became second nature. One afternoon, the snow stopped. A strange, heavy silence fell over the valley, and the sky turned a bruised, lavender gray. The temperature plummeted. "Need to check the fence line by the creek," Caleb announced after their noon meal of soup and bread. "Snow's heavy. Might have brought a wire down." "I'll come with you," Nora said. It wasn't a request. She was tired of the four walls of the cabin. He looked at her, about to object, then saw the resolve in her eyes. "All right, wrap up warm. It's a bitter cold out there." The cold was a physical thing. It burned the lungs and made the eyes water. The snow was crusted over, and their boots broke through with every step. A jarring, exhausting labor. When they reached the fence, they saw the problem immediately. It wasn't a wire brought down by snow. It was cut, sliced clean through with a pair of wire cutters. Caleb knelt, touching the clean, sharp edge of the wire with his gloved finger. "No storm did this," he said, his voice flat. Nora looked around. The landscape was pristine, a vast, unbroken blanket of white under the gray sky. There were no tracks, no sign of anyone. But who? "Snow's been falling steady for 2 weeks. This was done before the storm hit its worst," he said, thinking aloud. "Someone wanted my cattle to wander." He scanned the horizon, his eyes narrowed. He was a man who noticed things. A broken branch, a disturbed patch of ground. But here, there was nothing, just the silent, indifferent snow. He repaired the wire with a makeshift splice, his movements quick and angry. The walk back to the cabin was silent, the easy rhythm they had found now broken by a new, sharp note of unease. The feeling grew a few days later. He was splitting logs from the woodpile, which was now sheltered under a deep overhang of snow from the barn roof. As he kicked away a drift to get to the lower logs, he saw them, faint, almost completely obscured impressions in the older, packed snow beneath the new powder. Hoof prints, a single horse, shod, not his work horse, which was unshod for the winter. Someone had been here, close to the cabin, and recently they had stood, right here by his woodpile, and watched. The falling snow had nearly covered their tracks, but not completely. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the firelight less comforting. The wind had picked up again, and it clawed at the walls, no longer just a mournful sound, but a hungry one. Nora sat at the table, polishing the wooden spoon her mother had given her with a scrap of oiled cloth. Caleb sat by the fire, sharpening the blade of his carving knife on a whetstone. The rhythmic scrape of steel on the stone was a tense, grating sound in the small room. He looked at the two of them, bathed in the flickering light. He saw the spoon in her hand, a symbol of home, of hearth, of a life built around community and care. He looked at the knife in his own, a tool for survival, for self-sufficiency, for a life lived alone. They were two objects from two different worlds, both beautiful in their utility, both necessary. And, for the first time, he felt a profound and unsettling fear that neither would be enough to protect them from what was coming. The storm outside was just weather. The real storm, the one made of greed and men like Silas Blackthorne, was still gathering its strength. The thaw came without fanfare. One morning, the relentless moaning of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound silence and the gentle, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves. The sun, a stranger for weeks, appeared as a thin, white disk in a sky the color of milk. It offered little warmth, but its light was a promise. It meant the passes would soon be open. It meant the world was returning. 2 days later, they came. Caleb saw them first. 4 dark figures on horseback moving slowly against the blinding expanse of white. They were coming from the direction of town, following the creek bed where the snow was less deep. He was splitting wood by the barn, and the rhythmic thud of his axe was the only sound in the valley. He stopped, axe held loosely in his hand, and watched them approach. He felt no surprise, only a grim sense of inevitability. The peace had been temporary. He had known it all along. He left the axe buried in a log and walked back to the cabin. Nora was inside, kneading a new batch of sourdough on the floured tabletop. She looked up as he entered, her hands white with flour, a question in her eyes. "We have visitors," he said, his voice even. He took the Winchester rifle from the pegs above the door, checked the action with a practiced click-clack, and leaned it against the wall near his stool. He didn't want it in his hands. Not yet. Nora wiped her hands on her apron, her movements suddenly tense. "Who?" "I'd wager it's your former fiancé," he said, his gaze fixed on the door. "And he's brought the law with him." The riders stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, their horses steaming in the cold air. The lead rider was Silas Blackthorne. He was a man in his 40s, dressed in a fine black wool coat with a beaver fur collar that seemed to mock the harshness of the landscape. He sat his horse like he owned it and everything it stood on. Beside him was a man with a tarnished silver star pinned to his coat, Deputy Crane, a man whose face was a weak map of debt and indecision. Flanking them were 2 other men, hired guns by the look of their low-slung holsters and the dead-eyed way they surveyed the small homestead. One was older, with a face like cured leather. The other was young, barely out of his teens, with a nervous energy that seemed ill-suited to his profession. Caleb opened the door and stepped onto the threshold, letting the cold air wash over him. He stood with his arms crossed, a silent, immovable object in the doorway. He did not invite them closer. "Hart!" Blackthorne called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders. "I've come for my property." "I've got no property of yours, Blackthorne," Caleb replied, his tone low and flat. Blackthorne's thin lips twisted into a sneer. "Don't play dumb. It won't suit you. You're harboring a woman I paid good money for. A mail-order bride who broke her contract. I want her back." He gestured dismissively toward the cabin, as if indicating a stray calf. It was then that Nora stepped out from behind Caleb. She had taken off her apron and her face was pale, but her chin was high. She held a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I broke no contract, Mr. Blackthorne," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that cut through the cold. "You are the one who terminated our agreement." Blackthorne's eyes, cold and dark as river stones, finally settled on her. There was a flicker of annoyance in them, the irritation of an object that had suddenly found a voice. "That's a matter for a judge to decide. Right now, all that matters is that you are on this man's property, under his protection, after absconding from my care. Deputy, I am formally accusing Caleb Hart of stealing my betrothed." Deputy Crane shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "Now, Silas, let's not be hasty. Maybe we should just hear the young lady out." "I am not property," Nora said again, and this time her voice was iron. She stepped forward, past Caleb, and walked to the edge of the small, shoveled clearing in front of the door. She held up the paper. "This is the document you signed. It releases me from any and all obligations. It states our arrangement is terminated." As she spoke, her gaze swept over the four men. It passed over Blackthorn's cruel face, over the deputy's weak one, over the hardened older gunman, and then it met the eyes of the boy. For a split second, the world seemed to stop. The boy's jaw went slack, his eyes widening in disbelief. A flash of recognition, so potent it was almost a physical blow, passed between them. Nora's breath caught in her throat, under the wide brim of his hat, with the beginnings of a scruffy beard. It was a face she knew, a face from another life, a world of chalkboards and geography lessons in Boston. Evan Pike, a bright, troubled boy from a good family who had been in her class 2 years ago, before he'd run away from home, lured by dime novel fantasies of the West. Evan recovered quickly, his face snapping back into a mask of bored indifference. But he had seen her, and she had seen him. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a warning, a plea. She wasn't sure which. The deputy was looking at the paper in her hand. "Ma'am, could I see that document?" Nora held it out, and Crane urged his horse forward. He took the paper, unfolded it with clumsy, gloved fingers, and read. His face grew more troubled with every word. He looked from the paper to Blackthorn, then back again. "Silas, this is your signature. It says right here the agreement is ended." A piece of paper signed under duress. Blackthorn snapped, though a dark flush was creeping up his neck. The woman was hysterical, unsuitable. I was trying to calm her. "I was not hysterical," Nora said calmly. "I was dismissed. You left me at the stage station in a blizzard, with a document you now claim is meaningless. Which is it? Mr. Blackthorn, am I your betrothed, or am I unsuitable?" The logic of her words, delivered with the precision of a schoolteacher, hung in the air. The two gunmen exchanged a glance. Evan Pike stared intently at the horn of his saddle. This was not the simple retrieval they had been paid for. Caleb had not moved. He remained in the doorway, a silent guardian. His hands were empty, but his presence was a clear line drawn in the snow. He hadn't needed to say a word. Nora was fighting her own battle, and she was winning. Blackthorn saw it too. He saw the hesitation in his deputy, the wavering confidence in his hired guns. He shot a look of pure venom at Nora, then at Caleb. He had been made a fool of, publicly, on the doorstep of a man he despised. "This isn't over," he hissed, snatching the paper from Crane's hand and wheeling his horse around. He paused and looked back, his eyes promising a different kind of retribution. There are other kinds of justice in this valley. Heart, a man's reputation, a woman's honor. They're fragile things. The reputation in this valley is colder than winter. With that, he spurred his horse and galloped away, his men following in his wake. Evan Pike was the last to leave. As he turned his horse, he risked a quick glance back at Nora, a look filled with a tumult of apology, confusion, and fear, before he too was gone. 4 dark specks disappearing into the vast, indifferent white. The silence they left behind was heavier than the storm had ever been. Nora stood trembling, the adrenaline draining away, leaving her cold and exposed. Caleb stepped forward and gently put a hand on her arm. "Let's go inside." Inside, the warmth of the cabin felt like a sanctuary. Nora sank onto the stool by the stove, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. "You knew that boy," Caleb said. "It wasn't a question." She nodded, staring into the flames through the stove's small grate. "His name is Evan Pike. He was my student. He was brilliant, but so reckless. He wanted adventure. I never imagined. Her voice trailed off. A boy from her classroom was now a gunman for a man like Blackthorn. The West was smaller and more complicated than she had ever imagined. They didn't talk about it again that day. The unspoken threat from Blackthorn hung between them, a poison in the air. The illusion of their safe, isolated world had been shattered. They were no longer just two people surviving a storm. They were players in a dangerous game they were only beginning to understand. The proof of that came 3 nights later. They were awoken by a frantic squawking from the small chicken coop Caleb had built against the sheltered side of the barn. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the Winchester and pulling on his boots. By the time he got outside, lantern held high, the silence had returned. The coop door was torn from its leather hinges. Inside, the lantern light fell on a scene of quiet, senseless carnage. His 3 hens, providers of their precious few fresh eggs, were dead. Their necks had been wrung. It was not the work of a fox or a weasel. A predator kills to eat. This was a message. This was an execution. He found the tracks in the snow leading away from the coop. A single set of a man's boots. The message was clear. We can get to you. We can touch what is yours. We can destroy what is small and helpless. When he returned to the cabin, his face was a mask of cold fury. Nora knew from the look in his eyes what had happened. She felt no fear, only a slow burning anger that solidified into something hard and unyielding inside her. She had been judged, discarded, and threatened. Now, her small contribution to their shared life, the eggs she gathered each morning, had been stolen from her. She stood up and looked at Caleb, her eyes meeting his in the dim light of the lamp. That rifle, she said, her voice steady and clear. The Winchester. He looked at the gun, then back at her. Tomorrow, she said, you will teach me how to use it. The lessons with the Winchester began the next day. Caleb was a patient, methodical teacher. He broke the rifle down, naming each part, showing her how the mechanism fed a cartridge from the magazine into the chamber. He made her hold it until her arms stopped shaking, until the weight of the oiled walnut and blued steel felt familiar. They didn't fire a single shot for 2 days. It was all about the feel, the balance, the mechanics. He taught her how to stand, how to breathe, how to sight down the barrel at a knot on a distant fence post. He was teaching her how to use a tool, not a weapon. It was an extension of his philosophy. Know your tools, respect them, and they will serve you well. The threat from Blackthorn settled over them, a low-lying fog of menace. They spoke of it little, but it informed every action. Every trip to the barn was a little more watchful. Every strange sound in the night a cause for a shared, tense silence. They had become a garrison of 2. And then the great cold came. It was a cold that felt ancient and absolute, a cold that had seeped out of the heart of the mountains. It was different from the storm's fury. This was a quiet, relentless pressure. The air grew so thin and sharp it hurt to breathe. The world outside became crystalline and deadly still. Inside the cabin, the stove, which had been their sun and their shield, seemed to shrink in on itself. Caleb fed it constantly, keeping it roaring with a red-hot intensity, but its heat barely reached the corners of the room. A thick layer of frost grew on the inside of the window pane, intricate and beautiful, like a fern frozen in glass. That night, the cold laid siege. The nails in the log walls, shrinking in the intense freeze, began to pop. They went off like gunshots in the tense quiet. Sharp, violent cracks that made Nora jump each time. Crack! A sound from the roof. Ping! One from the wall near her bed. It was as if the cabin itself was in agony, its very bones crying out against the cold. Nora lay in the cot, buried under every blanket she possessed. It made no difference. The cold was a physical presence, a heavy weight that pressed down on her, leaching the warmth from her body. She curled into a tight ball, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. She could see her breath, a white plume in the dim light of the stove's grate. The fire was a distant, feeble star. She had never known such a cold. It was not just an absence of heat, it was an active, malevolent force. On his pallet of hides by the stove, Caleb was not asleep. He lay on his back, listening to the cabin groan and the sound of Nora's shivering. It was a desperate, uncontrollable sound. The sound of a body losing its fight for warmth. He knew this cold. He had felt it on the high plains during winter hunts, a cold that could freeze a man's blood in his veins. He knew that if her body temperature dropped too low, sleep would become a dangerous, irreversible slide into oblivion. He sat up, the firelight casting his broad shoulders in stark relief. He looked over at the cot, at the trembling mound of blankets, the principles he had lived by, the careful distance he had maintained, suddenly seemed like a foolish luxury in the face of this elemental enemy. Pride, reputation, fear of gossip, they were all meaningless when survival was on the line. He rose and pulled the heavy buffalo hide from his pallet. It was immense, the fur thick and bristly, the leather side worn smooth with age. He walked over to her cot. She watched him approach, her eyes wide and dark in the firelight, too cold even to be afraid. He didn't speak. He laid the massive hide over her, tucking it in around the edges of the cot, adding its formidable weight and insulation to the layers of wool. Then he sat down on the floor, his back against the wooden headboard of her bed. He pulled a corner of the hide over his own shoulders. "The cold will kill you like that," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Need to share warmth, just to stay alive." He leaned his head back against the wood, a solid, unmoving presence at her back. He wasn't in the bed. Not really. He was an anchor, a wall of warmth she could lean against. For a long moment, she remained rigid, a lifetime of propriety at war with the simple, desperate need of her body. Then, slowly, hesitantly, she uncurled. She shifted, turning onto her back, and let herself lean against the headboard, her shoulder just brushing against his. The contact was electric. Through the layers of wool, she could feel the solid heat of him, a steady, living warmth that was the antithesis of the killing cold. It flowed into her, pushing back the ice that had crept into her bones. The violent shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep, shuddering tremor. She let out a long, shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They sat like that for hours, in silence. The only sounds were the roar of the stove, the pop of the freezing nails, and the soft sound of their own breathing, falling slowly into a shared rhythm. Nora could feel the rise and fall of his chest through his thick wool shirt. It was the steadiest thing in the world. She was profoundly aware of him, of his scent of wood smoke and leather, of the sheer physical fact of his presence beside her. It was an intimacy deeper than any she had ever known, forged not of passion but of a shared struggle against the dark. She was not a woman in a man's room. She was a human being huddling for warmth with another, and in that simple, honest act, a wall inside her crumbled. She felt safe. For the first time since she had stepped off the train in this wild, unforgiving land, she felt completely and utterly safe, and as the night wore on, she finally slept, her head eventually slumping to rest on his shoulder. Nora woke first, to a world that was gray and still. The cold had broken its grip, and the cabin was quiet. She was warm, deeply and thoroughly warm. She was still leaning against Caleb. He had not moved all night. He was asleep, his head tilted back against the wall, his breathing deep and even. In sleep, the harsh lines of his face were softened, and he looked younger, more vulnerable. A lock of dark hair had fallen across his forehead. She had an almost overwhelming urge to reach out and brush it back. She resisted, her hand clenching into a fist under the blankets. Carefully, so as not to wake him. She slipped out from under the heavy hide and rose from the bed. She moved to the stove and added a log, her movement silent. The sourdough starter sat on the shelf, fat and bubbly. It was ready. It was time. She worked with a quiet purpose, mixing the flour, water, and starter on the small table. The familiar, rhythmic work of her hands was a comfort. She was creating something, bringing life and sustenance from the simplest of ingredients. As she shaped the dough into a round loaf, she felt a profound sense of rightness, as if she were finally in the place she was always meant to be. The sun was just beginning to touch the highest peaks of the Absarokas, painting them a pale, ethereal pink, when the smell of baking bread began to fill the small cabin. It was a warm, yeasty, hopeful smell, the scent of home. Caleb stirred, woken by the aroma. He sat up, rubbing the stiffness from his neck. He saw her by the stove, her back to him, her hair tied up in a loose knot. A fine dusting of flour covered the shoulders of her borrowed wool shirt. He watched her for a long moment. This woman who had come into his life like a piece of the storm, who had weathered his silence and his distance, who had faced down Silas Blackthorne with nothing but a piece of paper and her own unbroken spirit. She had brought sound and order, and now this life-affirming scent into his empty, quiet world. He stood and walked toward the stove to pour himself a cup of coffee. He had to pass directly behind her. As he drew level with her, she bent down to check the bread, the firelight from the open grate illuminating her face and catching the stray wisps of her hair, making them glow. She was focused, intent, beautiful in her competence. And in that moment, something in him broke its tether. It was not a decision. It was an impulse as natural and as powerful as the spring thaw that would soon break the valley's frozen grip. He stopped, leaned down, and pressed his lips gently into her flour-dusted, smoke-scented hair. It was a kiss so light it was barely there, a ghost of a touch, a fleeting warmth. He whispered the words into her hair, so quietly they were almost a thought. "You're my spring." Nora froze, her hand on the oven door. Every nerve in her body went still, waiting. She felt the warmth of his breath, then the impossible softness of his lips. The words settled over her, not with a shock, but with the quiet resonance of a truth she had known in her heart, but had not dared to acknowledge. He straightened up and continued on to the coffee pot, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever, as if nothing had happened, but everything had happened. A line had been crossed, not on the floor of the cabin, but in the vast, uncharted territory between their two hearts. She slowly closed the oven door, her own heart hammering against her ribs. She did not turn to look at him. She did not need to. She could feel his presence, a new and powerful current in the room. The fear of gossip, of what the world would say, was still there, a faint, chattering voice in the back of her mind. But another feeling was rising to meet it, a fierce, protective joy and a deep, terrifying hope for a home she had never thought she would find. The bread in the oven was rising, and so was her heart. The winter was not over, but in the small, warm space of the cabin, the spring had already begun. The kiss and the words that followed lingered in the air between them for days. They did not speak of it. There was no need. It was a truth that had been given a voice, and now it lived in the small cabin with them, in the shared glances over the rim of a coffee mug, in the careful way their hands avoided touching as they worked side by side. The world outside was thawing, the snow shrinking away from the base of the cabin logs, revealing the pale, sleeping earth. With the thaw came a new reality. Their supplies were critically low. The flour sack was nearly empty. The coffee tin held only a few days' worth of grounds, and the salt was a precious, dwindling dust. "I have to go to town," Nora announced one morning, her voice more decisive than it had been a month ago. Caleb was mending a harness, his hands methodically working in all through the thick leather. He stopped and looked at her. Sweet Sage was a day's ride away. assuming the trail along the creek was passable. It was also the heart of Silas Blackthorn's territory. "We can make do for a while longer," he said, his voice a low caution. "We can't," she countered gently. "You need salt for the cattle, and we need flour to live. I have some money from my teaching salary. It's not charity. It's my turn to provide." He saw the resolve in her eyes, the same steely determination she'd had when she'd asked him to teach her to use the Winchester. This was not a request for permission. He gave a slow nod. "I'll hitch up the buckboard." The journey to Sweet Sage was slow and arduous. The melting snow had turned the trail into a treacherous mix of mud and ice. Caleb handled the horses with a quiet, steady hand, his eyes constantly scanning the surrounding hills. Nora sat beside him, the Winchester resting across her lap. They barely spoke, but a current of shared purpose flowed between them when the small cluster of wooden buildings that made up the town finally came into view. Nestled in a bend of the creek, Nora felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was the world that had cast her out. Now she was walking back into it. Pratt's Mercantile was the town's hub, a long, low building that smelled of dust, cured meat, and calico. A pot-bellied stove radiated a suffocating heat in the center of the room. A woman with a face like a dried apple and hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes into slits stood behind the counter. This was Mrs. Pratt, the town's unofficial historian and chief magistrate of gossip. Her eyes flickered over Nora as she entered, taking in the ill-fitting men's trousers and the worn wool shirt. A look of sour disapproval settled on her face. Nora approached the counter, a short list in her hand. "Good morning. I need flour, salt, coffee, and some kerosene. Please." "Mrs." Pratt made no move to get the items. She leaned forward, her voice a loud, carrying whisper. "Well, look what the blizzard blew in. I heard you'd found shelter up at the Hart place. Seems you've made yourself right at home." Her eyes raked over Nora's clothes again, the insinuation as thick and greasy as bacon fat. Nora felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice even. "Mr. Hart was kind enough to offer me shelter from the storm. Yes, I'm here for supplies." "Supplies, Mrs." Pratt repeated, drawing the word out. Funny, isn't it a man like Caleb Hart, who keeps to himself for 10 years, suddenly takes in a boarder, a young woman. At that, people are talking. "Let them talk," a new voice said from the back of the store. A man in a tweed coat, with kind, intelligent eyes behind spectacles, stepped forward. He was followed by a woman with a gentle, dignified face. "Eliza, the young lady has asked for supplies. Not your opinion." It was Dr. Alder and his wife. Martha, the doctor, was the only educated man for 100 miles, and his wife was the quiet, steady force behind every church bake sale and quilting bee. They commanded a respect that even Mrs. Pratt could not entirely ignore. "Just making conversation. Doctor, Mrs." Pratt sniffed, though she turned, with ill grace, to begin measuring out the flour. Martha Alder smiled at Nora, a genuine, warm smile that was like a balm on a burn. "Nora Quinn, isn't it? We heard what happened at the stage station. A disgraceful business. We're glad to see you are safe." "Thank you," Nora said, her voice thick with gratitude. "You're very kind." The transaction was completed in a tense silence. As Nora counted out her money, she was aware of the other customers in the store, their averted eyes, their sudden, intense interest in the pickle barrel. She was a spectacle, a story, a scandal, walking out of the store, with the doctor, Alder carrying the heavy sack of flour for her. She felt as if she had run a gauntlet. They passed the small, white-painted church, its steeple sharp against the pale blue sky. On an impulse, Nora stopped. "What day is it?" she asked. "Saturday," replied the doctor. "Tomorrow is the Sabbath," Martha added. An idea, bold and terrifying, began to form in Nora's mind. She had been hiding. She had been letting other people like Silas Blackthorne and Eliza Pratt, write her story. She looked at the church, at its solid, honest door. That was where the community gathered. That was where the truth was supposed to matter. The next morning, she put on the only dress she owned, the one she'd been wearing when she arrived. It was wrinkled and a little damp from its time in a heap on the cabin floor, but it was hers. She brushed her hair until it shone and tied it back with a simple ribbon. When Caleb saw her, he stopped in his tracks. He had only ever seen her in his own rough clothes. Seeing her now, in her own dress, she was a stranger again, a woman from another world. But the resolve in her eyes was the same. "I'm going to church," she said. He simply nodded and went to hitch the horses. The church was full. The service was simple. The pews filled with ranchers, their wives, and a restless collection of children. Nora and Caleb sat in the back. She was acutely aware of the whispers, the sideways glances. Silas Blackthorne was there, sitting in the front pew as if he were the deacon himself, his presence a heavy, oppressive weight. The Reverend Cole Younger was an old man with a voice like the rustle of dry leaves and eyes that had seen too many hard winters and too many broken hearts. He preached a simple sermon about bearing false witness. As he spoke, his eyes seemed to find Nora in the back of the church when the final hymn was sung and the congregation began to stir. The Reverend held up a hand. "Please, wait a moment," he said, his quiet voice commanding attention. "This morning, we have a member of our community who has been much discussed in private whispers. I believe that truth, like a harvest, is best brought out into the open sun. Miss Nora Quinn has asked to speak. Our Lord listened to the words of all, and so shall we." A shocked silence fell over the church. People turned in their pews to stare. Nora's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Caleb gave her hand a quick, firm squeeze, a silent transfer of strength. She stood up and walked the long aisle to the front of the church, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She stood before the congregation, a lone, slight figure, and took a deep breath. "My name is Nora Quinn," she began, her voice shaking only slightly. "Many of you have heard stories about me. Today, I want to tell you the truth." She told them everything, her voice growing stronger and clearer with every word. She spoke of the advertisement, of her journey from Boston, of the contract she had signed in good faith. She did not raise her voice. She did not use words of anger or accusation. She simply stated the facts. And then, she held up the folded piece of paper Silas had signed. "This is the document, Mr. Blackthorne gave me when he left me at the stage station, on the first day of the blizzard. It is a termination of our agreement, signed in his own hand." She looked directly at Silas Blackthorne. His face was a thunderous mask of fury, but he said nothing. He was trapped by the sanctity of the place. "I am not a piece of property," Nora said, her voice ringing through the silent church. "My honor is not a commodity to be bought or sold or discarded when it becomes inconvenient. I came west for a new life, a partnership. I found myself treated as a pawn in a business deal. I have done nothing to be ashamed of. I am a teacher. I wish only to live with dignity and earn my own way." She finished and stood in the ringing silence. Then, a woman in the third row, the wife of a small rancher who had been fighting Blackthorne over water rights for years, stood up. "She speaks the truth," the woman said, her voice trembling but clear. "Silas Blackthorne tried to squeeze us out last year." Another woman stood, then another, a small handful of them, women who had been bullied or cheated by the man in the front pew. But just as many looked away. They looked at their husbands, whose jobs at Blackthorne's ranch paid for their food. They looked down at their hands, their faces set in fear. The community was split right down the middle, a visible line drawn between those who had the courage to stand and those who did not. Nora walked back down the aisle, her head held high, and sat beside Caleb. He looked at her, and in his eyes was a look of such profound respect, such deep and quiet pride, that it was more powerful than any embrace. They left the church and did not look back. That night, the cold returned, and they sat by the fire, the events of the day unspoken between them. The tension was a living thing in the small room. Suddenly, there was a sharp, cracking sound, followed by the tinkle of falling glass. A rock, the size of a man's fist, lay on the floorboards amidst a spider web of shattered window pane. The wind, cold and victorious, rushed into the cabin. Caleb was at the window in an instant, the Winchester in his hand. But there was nothing out there but the darkness and the sound of a horse galloping away into the night. The sanctuary was broken. The violence they had feared had found them. Nora swept up the broken glass while Caleb went to the barn. He returned with a hammer, some nails, and a wide plank of wood. Without a word, they worked together. He held the board over the gaping hole where the window had been, and she held the lantern high so he could see. The sound of his hammer, driving the nails home, was a defiant rhythm in the night. Bang, bang, bang! A sound that said, "You can break our window, but you cannot break us." When it was done, the cabin was dark, the single source of light now covered. "It'll have to do till I can get a new pane from Sheridan," he said, his voice rough. "It's a strange thing," Nora said quietly, looking at the raw wood that now covered the window. "All my life, I felt as if I was waiting to be chosen, by a school, by a husband. It was Silas who chose me, and it was Silas who discarded me. Today, in that church, for the first time, I felt like I was the one doing the choosing." Caleb looked at her, his face lit by the single lantern. "And what did you choose?" "To tell the truth," she said. "To not be ashamed, to not be a victim." She looked at the wooden patch, a scar on their small home, and to stay. "I'm choosing to stay." He nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. The broken glass represented her reputation, shattered by lies and gossip. The wooden board was their answer. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't perfect, but it was solid. It was real. It was the work of their own hands, a repair made of truth and labor, and it would hold against the wind. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a muddy, boisterous force. The snow retreated to the high peaks, leaving the valley floor sodden and greening with a fierce, urgent life. The creek, swollen with meltwater, roared like a wild thing. And with the opening of the land came the opening of hearts. Nora's stand in the church had planted a seed, and now, in the warming sun, it began to grow. The idea for a schoolhouse started as a conversation with Martha Alder and grew into a community project. The small ranchers and homesteaders, the same ones who had stood with Nora or had looked away in fear, found common ground in the future of their children. A patch of land was donated, lumber was pledged, and on a bright, breezy morning, the work began. It was a day of rare and simple joy. The valley came together not for a funeral or a wedding, but to build something. The air rang with the sound of hammers and saws, the shouts of men, and the laughter of children playing tag among the stacks of fresh-cut pine. Nora was at the center of it all, not as a scandal or a victim, but as a teacher. She had a slate propped against a log, and a dozen children, who had never before held a piece of chalk, were gathered around her. She was teaching them their letters, her face animated and glowing with a purpose she had not felt since leaving Boston. Caleb was there, working with the other men. He moved with a quiet competence, his broad shoulders easily lifting beams into place. But his eyes were never far from Nora. He watched her with the children, saw the natural authority and kindness in her bearing, and felt a rightness in his soul so profound it was almost an ache. This was the spring he had spoken of, not just a season, but a state of being. It was the sound of her voice naming the letters of the alphabet. It was the sight of her standing in the sun, a smudge of chalk on her cheek. They were raising the first wall when a boy, chasing after a runaway dog, stopped and pointed a trembling finger toward the west. "Look!" he screamed, his voice thin with terror. "Fire!" Every head turned. A thick, greasy column of black smoke was boiling into the clear blue sky. It was rising from the direction of Caleb's homestead, from the direction of his barn. For a heartbeat, the world stood still, the sounds of building replaced by a collective, horrified gasp. Then chaos erupted. Men dropped their tools, shouting, running for horses or wagons. Caleb was already moving, his face a grim, stony mask. He untied his horse in 3 swift motions and swung into the saddle. Nora was right behind him, her skirt hitched up, her face pale but her eyes blazing. "I'm coming with you," she cried, and he reached down, pulling her up to sit behind him without breaking stride. The ride was a frantic, desperate blur. The smell of the smoke grew stronger, a choking, acrid stench of burning hay and old wood. It was the smell of a year's labor, of their security, turning to ash. When they cleared the last rise, the sight that met them stole the breath from their lungs. The hay barn was an inferno, a roaring, monstrous thing of orange and black, flames leaping 100 feet into the air. The heat was a physical blow, even from a distance. The cabin, their small, precious home, stood perilously close, the wind pushing a shower of glowing embers onto its dry, weathered roof. Caleb reined the horse to a sliding stop and jumped from the saddle before it had even stopped moving. "The well bucket," he yelled, running toward the cabin. Nora slid down after him, her mind racing, a cold, clear terror cutting through her panic. The well was slow to draw. 1 bucket at a time would be like spitting on a furnace. She saw the cause then, lying near the corner of the burning barn, where the flames had not yet reached, was a discarded torch, a thick branch wrapped in oil-soaked rags, still smoldering. This was no accident. This was the answer to her speech in the church. The rest of the community was arriving, a chaotic jumble of wagons and riders. Men ran toward the fire, some with buckets, others with shovels, their efforts brave but disorganized against the sheer fury of the blaze. The barn was lost. Nora knew it instantly, but the cabin and the small stable beside it where the milk cow and horses were kept could be saved. "The creek!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the panicked yells of the men. Everyone turned to look at her. "Form a line, a bucket brigade from the creek to the house. Soak the roof and the walls." For a second, they just stared at her. This woman in a dress, giving orders. Then Dr. Alder, his face smeared with soot, nodded sharply. "She's right to the creek move." The men responded, self-preservation and common sense overriding their surprise. A human chain formed, stretching from the bank of the rushing creek to the endangered cabin. Buckets, pots, anything that could hold water were passed down the line, a frantic, rhythmic ballet of desperation. Caleb was on the roof of the cabin, heedless of the embers that landed on his clothes, dousing the smoking shingles with the water that was passed up to him. But the heat was too intense. The grass between the barn and the cabin was dry from the long winter, and small fires were beginning to catch, creeping like fiery snakes toward their home. Nora saw the danger. They were fighting the fire, but they weren't stopping it. "Shovels!" she cried out, grabbing a rancher by the arm. "We need a fire break. We have to dig here." She pointed to a line in the dirt, 20 feet from the cabin, a wide swath of earth that they had to clear down to the bare soil. "Dig a trench. Now we have to stop it from spreading." Her urgency was contagious. A half-dozen men with shovels, including the rancher whose wife had first stood for her in the church, broke from the bucket line and began to dig, their blades tearing at the prairie sod with a desperate fury. Nora picked up a discarded grain sack and began beating at the small grass fires, her hair coming loose from its ribbon, a wild, fierce energy possessing her. The smoke burned her lungs, the heat scorched her face, and an ember landed on her sleeve, burning through the fabric to her skin. but she barely felt it. They were a single organism now, this small group of people, fighting for this one small piece of land. It was in the midst of this chaos that Silas Blackthorne appeared. He rode up on his fine black horse, stopping on the ridge overlooking the scene. He was accompanied by the older of his 2 hired guns, a man they called Hawk Bill. Blackthorne didn't dismount. He simply sat there, watching the destruction, a look of cold, satisfied amusement on his face. He let his voice drift down to them, a lazy, mocking drawl that was somehow more chilling than a shout. A shame. Heart, the spring winds catch fire so easy. Caleb, on the roof, turned and looked at him, his face black with soot, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. He didn't say a word. He just stared, a promise of future violence hanging in the space between them. But before anyone could react, another rider came up the trail, this one wearing the tarnished star of the county sheriff. Sheriff Hale was an older, heavier man than his deputy, and he moved with a slow deliberation that belied a sharp mind. He took in the scene at a glance, the burning barn, the desperate fight to save the cabin, and Silas Blackthorne watching it all like a king at a gladiatorial game. "What's going on here?" Silas the sheriff asked, his voice deceptively mild. "Just offering my condolences to my neighbor on his misfortune," Blackthorne said with a thin smile. "Is that so?" the sheriff said. "Because I just got a visit from a very frightened young man. Evan Pike," said his conscience got the better of him, "said you paid Hawk Bill here $50 to set this fire." Hawk Bill's hand instinctively dropped to the pistol at his hip. Blackthorne's face went rigid. "That's a ridiculous accusation." "Is it?" the sheriff repeated, his eyes not leaving Hawk Bill. "Because Evan also said you told Bill to leave the torch behind as a message. A torch just like that one." Maybe he pointed a thick finger at the smoldering branch lying near the inferno. Hawk Bill's nerve broke. He spurred his horse, trying to wheel around and flee, but he was too slow. Sheriff Hale's pistol was in his hand with a speed that was shocking in a man his size. "Don't even think about it," he said, his voice now cold as iron. He dismounted, pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt, and walked toward the terrified gunman. "You're under arrest for arson." "Bill!" Hawk Bill offered no resistance. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Blackthorne exploded. "This is an outrage!" "Hale, you're taking the word of a runaway boy over mine." "I'm taking the evidence I see with my own eyes," the sheriff said, pulling Bill's horse behind his own. "And right now, I see your man caught red-handed. We can sort out your part in it down at my office." He looked at the faces of the homesteaders, who had stopped their work to watch, their faces grim and accusing. "Seems to me you've got a lot of questions to answer, Silas, not just to me, but to your neighbors." He turned and led his prisoner away, leaving Silas Blackthorne alone on the ridge. The victor's smirk wiped from his face, replaced by the stunned fury of a man whose power had finally, publicly, been challenged and found wanting. He stared down at the soot-stained people, at their hard, unforgiving eyes, and, for the first time, he looked like a man who was afraid. The fight was not over, but the turning point had passed. With renewed vigor, the community attacked the fire, and by dusk, it was out. The barn was a smoking, blackened skeleton against the twilight sky. Half of Caleb's winter hay, his investment, his security, was gone. But the cabin was saved. The stable was saved. They were saved. As the neighbors began to depart, their face grim but resolute, the rancher who had led the digging of the firebreak walked up to Caleb. "That was a dirty piece of work." "Caleb," he said, nodding toward the road Blackthorne had taken, "he's been trying to buy us all out, one by one, threatening our water. Well, that's over. We had a talk, me and the others. None of us are selling. Not a drop of water, not an inch of land. He wanted to isolate you. Instead, he's made us a community." He clapped Caleb on the shoulder, nodded to Nora, and left, one by one. Others did the same, offering a word of support, a promise of help. Finally, they were alone. Nora and Caleb stood side by side, covered in soot and grime. Exhausted to the bone, they looked at the smoking ruins, then at their saved home. They had lost so much. But as they looked at the dark, rich earth of the firebreak, the scar that had protected them, they knew they had gained something far more valuable. They had found their place. They had found their people. They stood together in the ruins, the smell of smoke and wet earth all around them, and watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. The aftermath of the fire was a season of labor and quiet solidarity. Neighbors came with gifts of dried hay from their own meager stores. The men who had worked on the schoolhouse came back on their own time and helped Caleb build a new, smaller barn. The scent of fresh-cut pine mingling with the lingering smell of soot. In this shared work, a new kind of peace settled over the valley. The fear of Silas Blackthorne had been replaced by a communal resolve. The final blow to Blackthorne's ambitions was delivered not by a sheriff or a lawsuit, but by a surveyor's map. News traveled slowly, but it arrived with the certainty of the changing seasons. Dr. Alder, returning from a trip to Sheridan for medical supplies, brought the official word. The Northern Pacific had finalized its route for the new spur line. It would bypass Sage Valley entirely, cutting north through the foothills where the grading was easier. The valley's water, the resource Blackthorne had schemed and cheated and burned to control, was suddenly just water again. His grand vision of a railhead town, with him as its king, had evaporated. His collection of land deeds was now just a portfolio of second-rate ranch land. A week after the news became common knowledge, he came back to Caleb's homestead. This time, he was not flanked by gunmen. He came in a polished black buggy, accompanied by a pale, thin man in a city suit who carried a leather satchel. They stopped the buggy where the new barn stood, a testament to the community Blackthorne had tried to break. Caleb and Nora were mending the fence by the creek, the same fence that had once been cut. They saw the buggy and walked together to meet it, moving as one. They stopped a few feet away, their hands clean, but their clothes marked by honest work. The lawyer climbed down from the buggy, his city shoes ill-suited for the soft spring earth. Blackthorne remained seated, his face sallow, his eyes holding the flat, dead light of a defeated man. Mr. Hart. Miss Quinn, the lawyer began, his voice smooth and out of place. My name is Mr. Egan. I represent Mr. Blackthorne. We have come to make you a proposition. He opened his satchel. My client is prepared to offer you a generous sum for this parcel of land, $5,000, in cash. The amount was staggering, a fortune for a homesteader. It was enough to buy a fine house back east, to live a life free from brutal winters and the threat of fire. Nora felt a brief, dizzying flash of what that money could mean. Caleb didn't even look at the lawyer. His eyes were fixed on Blackthorne. He saw a man hollowed out by his own greed. The land's not for sale, Caleb said, his voice quiet. Mr. Hart, perhaps you don't understand, the lawyer persisted, a condescending edge to his tone. This is a very substantial offer, more than this land will ever be worth. You're the one who doesn't understand, Caleb said, his gaze unwavering. He gestured to the ground beneath their feet, to the greening pasture that sloped down to the roaring creek. This land isn't for cash. This land is for the footprints of our children. It's not for sale. The lawyer looked flustered, turning to his client for guidance. But Blackthorne just stared at Caleb and Nora, standing together, their shoulders almost touching. He saw not two individuals, but a single, unbreakable unit. It was then that Nora spoke, her voice clear and steady. Not for Blackthorne or his lawyer, but for Caleb. I was sent out here to become part of a business arrangement, she said, looking at the man she loved. I was a piece of paper, a claim to be filed. When I was left here, my only thought was of restoring my honor, of clearing my name. But honor isn't something you find in a town's opinion. You find it in your own heart." She took a step closer to Caleb. "This place, this small cabin with its patched window, this is not just a shelter. It has become my home. This man is my family. I am not staying because I have to. I am choosing to stay because this is where I belong." The finality in her voice was absolute. The choice was made, the vow already taken in her heart. Blackthorn gave a curt, bitter nod to his driver. The buggy turned and rumbled away, leaving behind only the scent of dust and failure. That evening, as the sun set behind the Apsarokas, casting long shadows across the valley, Caleb took Nora's hand. They stood by the creek, under the branches of a giant cottonwood tree whose leaves were just beginning to unfurl. "My mother," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion. "She died believing she was a failure, that she'd followed a man's empty promises to her grave. I never wanted that for anyone." He turned to face her, his hands enclosing hers. "Nora Quinn, you are a woman of your own choosing. I am asking you, would you choose to be my wife?" Tears welled in Nora's eyes, not of sadness, but of a joy so profound it was painful. "I have already chosen," she whispered. "Yes, Caleb, yes." Their wedding was held 3 days later, under that same cottonwood tree. It was as simple and as beautiful as the valley itself. The entire community came. They brought with them not fine gifts, but gifts from the heart jars of preserves, a freshly smoked ham, loaves of bread, and pies still warm from the oven. Martha Alder brought a bolt of blue calico she had been saving, and the women had worked through the night to sew Nora a simple, beautiful wedding dress. Reverend Cole Younger performed the ceremony, his voice filled with a gentle wisdom as he spoke of partnership and shared burdens. Nora looked out at the faces of her neighbors, the people who had formed a bucket line to save her home, and knew she was richer than Silas Blackthorn had ever been. Just as the Reverend was asking for the rings, a lone rider approached. It was Evan Pike. He had left Blackthorn's employ the day of the fire and had not been seen since. He dismounted, his hat in his hands, his young face a mixture of shame and resolve. He walked up to Caleb and Nora. "I heard about the wedding," he said, his voice low. "I know I have no right, but I gave my testimony to Sheriff Hale. Against Blackthorn, I wanted to stand for something right. For once." He looked at Nora, his former teacher. "If you'll have me, I'd be honored to stand as your witness." Nora smiled through her tears and nodded. Evan Pike, the boy who had run west seeking adventure, stood beside them, a witness to a truer and braver story than any he had ever read in a dime novel. Caleb had no ring to give, save one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thin, worn band of gold, polished smooth with age. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice thick. He slipped it onto Nora's finger. It was a perfect fit. The rest of the day was a blur of fiddle music, food, and laughter. For the first time, the valley was not just a place of survival, but a place of celebration. That night, after the last neighbor had departed and a profound, peaceful quiet had settled over the homestead, they stood together in the cabin. The room was the same, yet entirely different. The fire in the stove cast a warm, gentle glow. A single lamp was lit on the table, beside the last slice of a wedding gift apple pie. For months, the cot against the wall had been her space, and the floor by the fire had been his. The bed had been a boundary, a symbol of the careful distance between them. Now, it was simply a bed, their bed. There was a shyness between them now, a gentle hesitancy that had not been there when they were fighting fires or facing down gunmen. He took her hand. "Nora Hart," he said, testing the sound of it. It sounded right. She prepared for bed behind the hanging blanket, as she always had. But this time it was not a barrier of propriety, but a curtain of quiet ritual. When she emerged, wearing a simple white nightgown Martha Alder had given her, he was waiting, He had blown out the lamp, and the only light was from the fire's glow. He held back the covers of the bed for her. She slipped in, and the sheets were cool against her skin. He walked around to the other side and lay down beside her, the ropes of the cot creaking under his weight. He did not touch her, not at first. They lay side by side, staring up at the dark, timbered ceiling. The air was thick with all the things they had never said, all the feelings they had held back. She could hear his breathing, deep and steady. It was the same sound that had comforted her during the great cold, but now it was closer, a sound of profound intimacy. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, a living heat that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with home. Slowly, she turned onto her side to face him. He did the same. In the flickering firelight, she could see the truth in his eyes, the long years of solitude, the deep well of his goodness. He reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers impossibly tender against her skin. There was no passion in that moment, but something far deeper. There was trust. There was peace. There was the overwhelming, breathtaking relief of a long journey ended. She moved closer, resting her head in the hollow of his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. She was not a piece of property, not a scandal, not a survivor. She was a wife in her husband's arms, in her own home, and as she listened to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, she fell asleep, not with the exhaustion of fear, but with the profound and gentle peace of a final, irrevocable choice. 4 autumns had passed, each one painting the cottonwoods along the creek in brilliant strokes of gold. The cabin was no longer just a cabin. A new room had been added, built of sturdy pine, with a real glass window that looked out onto the mountains. What had once been a bare patch of earth was now Nora's garden, fenced against the deer, its soil dark and rich from years of care. Even now, in the waning days of the season, late pumpkins sat plump and orange among the withered vines, and the last of the hardy greens stood crisp in the cool air. The homestead was no longer a lonely outpost. It was a place of deep and settled life. The schoolhouse, which had once been a dream and a pile of lumber, was now the valley's heart. From its single room came the sound of children's voices reciting their multiplication tables, and Nora's clear, patient tones guiding them. She was no longer Miss Quinn, the woman from Boston. She was Mrs. Hart, their teacher, a respected pillar of the community she had helped to build. Caleb had changed, too. The solitude he had once wrapped around himself like a cloak had fallen away, replaced by a quiet, confident engagement with the world. He had entered into a partnership with their nearest neighbor to the west, an old Crow man named Sam Standing Bear. Sam's people had lived in this valley for generations, and he understood the rhythms of the grass and the water in a way no white man did. Together, he and Caleb had implemented a system of rotational grazing, moving their combined herds between pastures to allow the land to rest and recover. The grass on their properties grew thicker and healthier than anywhere else in the valley. It was a partnership built on mutual respect, a quiet acknowledgement that the land belonged to no one and that their duty was to care for it. They had a son, a sturdy 4-year-old named Thomas, with his father's dark hair and his mother's serious, intelligent eyes. His footprints were everywhere in the mud by the creek, in the dust of the new barn, in the flour Nora sometimes spilled on the cabin floor. He was the embodiment of Caleb's promise, the future made real. One crisp afternoon, as Nora was walking home from the schoolhouse with Thomas's hand in hers, she saw it. A polished black buggy, the same one she remembered with a shudder, was making its slow way up the trail to their homestead. Her steps faltered for a moment, a cold echo of old fear, but it passed as quickly as it came. That was a lifetime ago. She was not the same woman. When the buggy stopped in the yard, the man who climbed down was not the same man either. Silas Blackthorne was stooped and thin, his expensive black coat hanging loosely on his shrunken frame. His face was a pale, gaunt mask, his eyes sunken and weary. He moved with the slow, deliberate care of a man who is in constant pain. Caleb came out of the new barn, wiping his hands on a rag, and stood beside Nora. They formed a silent, united front as Blackthorn approached, his hat held in a trembling hand. "Hart, ma'am," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He did not look them in the eye, his gaze fixed on the ground somewhere between them. "I won't take much of your time. I've come on a matter of business." "We have no business with you, Blackthorn," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. "This business isn't with you," Blackthorn replied, finally raising his eyes. They were filled not with malice, but with a profound and hollow emptiness. "It's with the school." He gestured vaguely in the direction of the town. "I've spoken with Reverend Cole. I've made arrangements to establish a trust, a considerable sum, enough to pay the teacher's salary for the next 20 years, enough for books, for a new roof when it's needed, for a proper well." Nora and Caleb stood in stunned silence. The sum he was talking about was a fortune, an act of transformative generosity. Why, Nora asked, the single word cutting through the still afternoon air. Blackthorn looked at her then, and she saw the ghost of the man he had been, a flicker of pride warring with his shame. "A man reaches a certain age," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He looks back at his life and takes stock of what he has built. My ledgers are full, but my house is empty. I have no heir, no legacy but a name that people curse. I wish for my money to do some good in this world before I leave it." He was trying to buy his redemption, to purchase a clean final page for his life's bitter story. The next Sunday, Reverend Cole announced the donation to the congregation. A wave of murmurs and shocked whispers filled the small church. The money was a godsend, but it came from a tainted source. After the service, the community gathered outside, a spontaneous town meeting under the cottonwoods. They debated. Some argued that taking his money was letting him win, that he was trying to buy their forgiveness. But it was Martha Alder who spoke the words that settled the matter. "Silas Blackthorn's soul is his own affair," she said, her voice calm and reasonable. "Our forgiveness is not for sale at any price, but our children's future is a different matter. They are innocent in this. If his guilt can provide them with books and a better school, then let it. We will not accept this gift for Silas's honor. We will accept it for our children." And so it was decided. The money was accepted. The future of the school was secured. But no one went to shake Silas Blackthorn's hand. He left town in his black buggy, as alone as he had arrived. He made one last stop. He came back to the Hart homestead and waited in the yard until Nora came out. Caleb stood in the doorway of the cabin, watchful. "They took the money," Blackthorn stated, his voice flat. "The children thank you," Nora said simply. He stood for a long moment, a frail, broken man searching for a word, a look, some small token of absolution. Can you ever forgive what I did?" he asked, the words seeming to be pulled from the depths of his soul. Nora looked at him, at the man who had tried to ruin her, who had burned their barn and threatened their lives. She felt no anger. She felt no hatred. She felt only a profound and weary pity. "I forgave you a long time ago, Mr. Blackthorn," she said, her voice gentle. "I did it for me, not for you. I had to let go of the hate, or it would have poisoned me. I wish you peace on your journey." It was the kindest, and also the cruelest, thing she could have said. She was offering him nothing for himself, no comfort, no erasure of his sins. Her forgiveness was a closed circle, an act of self-preservation that had nothing to do with him. He seemed to shrink even further into himself. He gave a single, jerky nod, turned without another word, and climbed into his buggy for the last time. As he drove away, Nora knew she was finally, and completely, free of him. That night, a cool autumn wind whispered around the corners of the expanded cabin. The air was rich with the scent of coming frost and wood smoke. Inside, A fire crackled in the stove, a bastion of warmth and light against the growing dark. Thomas was asleep in the new room, tucked under a quilt Nora had made. In the main room, the scene was one of deep, domestic peace. Caleb sat on his stool, mending a piece of harness, the familiar, rhythmic work of his hands as steady as his heartbeat. Nora was at the table, kneading dough for the morning's bread, her movements practiced and sure. The light from the lamp cast a golden glow on her hands, dusted with flour. Caleb stopped his work and watched her, a slow smile touching his lips. He remembered another night, long ago, when he had seen her just like this, a beacon of life in the midst of a terrible winter. "Do you remember that first winter?" he asked, his voice soft. She looked up, a dusting of flour on her nose. "I remember a cold so deep I thought my bones would break." "I remember that, too," he said, "but I also remember the morning after. You were baking bread, the first real bread this cabin had ever known." She smiled, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "And I remember a man who was afraid to hope." He put down his leather work and came to her, standing behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. He breathed in the scent of her, of yeast and wood smoke and the faint, clean smell of soap. It was the smell of his life. "I said something foolish that morning," he murmured into her hair. "You said, 'You're my spring,'" she whispered, leaning back against the solid wall of his chest. "It was true then," he said. "You came into the dead of my winter and brought the world back to life." He held her tighter. "But it's even truer now. It's not just a season anymore. Nora, it's the air we breathe. It's the house we've built. It's the food in our bellies and our son sleeping in his bed. It's the harvest. You are my enduring spring." She turned in his arms and kissed him, a kiss of deep, abiding love, a quiet testament to the years of shared labor and shared joy. Outside, the wind blew, a reminder that the world was still wild and that winter would, eventually, come again. There would be other storms, other hardships, other fires, but they would face them together. They had their home, their community, and a love that had been forged in the coldest of fires, a love that had not only survived, but had blossomed. Thank you for listening to our story tonight. We'd love for you to comment where you're listening from, so we can all connect, and please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night. Like the video, and press the hype button to help share this story with more people.